Now we move into Section 2. In Section 2, the main idea is that a new wave of government initiative starting in 1935 resulted in some strong successes and some stunning defeats for President Roosevelt. Our learning objectives are to identify the key programs of the second 100 days, to explain how the New Deal programs helped to revive organized labor, and explain why 1937 was a troubled year for Roosevelt and the Second New Deal. So looking at the second 100 days, Roosevelt launched the Second New Deal in the spring of 1935. Congress passed laws extending government oversight of the banking industry, and it raised taxes on the wealthy. Congress funded new relief programs. As far as emergency relief, the Emergency Relief Appropriations Act stopped direct payments to Americans in need. The Works Progress Administration, or WPA, was the largest peacetime jobs program in U.S. history. As far as Social Security, this was created, and of course it's still around today. It provided guaranteed regular payments for many people 65 and older. And it included a system of unemployment insurance. The New Deal began to revive organized labor as well. The National Industrial Recovery Act, or NIRA, guaranteed workers the right to form unions and to bargain collectively. However, it was difficult to enforce and fatally weakened by the Supreme Court's ruling in Schechter Poultry Corporation versus the United States. Roosevelt backed the Wagner Act, or the National Labor Relations Act, or the NLRA. This outlawed a number of anti-labor practices, it established the National Labor Relations Board, and it gave the authority to conduct voting in workplaces to determine whether employees wanted union representation. The Committee of Industrial Organization, or CIO, was born in 1935. John L. Lewis led this group to break away from the American Federation of Labor, or AFL. Now, of course, the groups have since merged now to form the AFL-CIO. So once again, they're now united, but they did, at this point in time, the CIO broke off of the AFL. The United Auto Workers was a division of the CIO, and they launched a successful sit-down strike in 1936. Now looking at the election of 1936. Roosevelt passed the Rural Electrification Act, which provided electricity to millions of farmers, showcased his achievements. For example, unemployment was cut in half, income and business earnings were up, New Deal programs provided hope and help, and he spoke out against big business. His critics, Republicans, argued that the New Deal was overly bureaucratic and was creating a planned economy, which would be much closer to what you would see under socialism. American Liberty League tried to stop Roosevelt's attack on big business. Republican Alf Landon did not pose a serious threat. So the results, a tremendous victory for Roosevelt. Alf Landon carried only 2 states. The Union Party candidate polled less than 2% of the popular vote, and the Democrats again gained seats in both houses of Congress. So all in all, we'd have to say the 1936 election was a tremendous success. But then we head into 1937, a troubled year, as Roosevelt starts his second term. Roosevelt surprised Congress with a plan to reorganize the nation's courts. In the fall of 1937, the nation's economy suffered another setback, and although the Supreme Court began to rule in favor of New Deal legislation, and the economy began to rebound in the summer of 1938, the positive feelings about Roosevelt and the New Deal had begun to fade. So we start by looking at Roosevelt's court packing plan. Roosevelt's plan gave the president the power to appoint many new judges and to expand the Supreme Court by up to 6 judges. Roosevelt argued that the changes were needed to make the courts more efficient. Most observers saw the plan as an effort to pack the court with friendly justices. And I think really it's pretty obvious that that's really it was what he wanted to do. Whenever there's an opening on the Supreme Court, It is a big deal because the president gets to appoint that person to the Supreme Court to fill that opening. Now, it does require Senate confirmation, but if the Senate is controlled by the president's party, it's not too hard to get that Senate confirmation. And so, anytime there's an opening on the court, presidents like that. That works in their favor because, especially if it's somebody who tends to be on the other side of the aisle. If you've got a more liberal president and a more conservative justice leaving the court, that's an opportunity for them to appoint a more liberal justice to replace that retiring justice. This court packing plan would give Roosevelt the opportunity to appoint as many as 6 new justices to the Supreme Court, thus giving him a large majority. Currently, there are 9 members on the Supreme Court. Adding 6 would take it to 15, and normally you tend to have a pretty divided court that may split on decisions 5-4. You add 6 more people, even if you were in the minority before, maybe you're likely to come out 10-5. Many Americans kind of saw through it and realized that this was not such a good idea. So the result, the plan didn't pass. However, the Supreme Court made some rulings then that favored New Deal legislation. The Supreme Court upheld a minimum wage law in Washington state, and the court ruled in favor of a key element of the Wagner Act. The court declared the Social Security plan to be constitutional. These were all successes for Roosevelt, although the court packing plan cost him credibility. But unfortunately for Roosevelt, we hit an economic downturn in 1937 as well. So looking at the nation's economy, 1937 witnessed an economic downturn that began with a sharp drop in the stock market. By the end of the year, about 2 million Americans had lost their jobs. So here we're on the road to recovery, and then things begin to slide back downhill. Roosevelt had hoped to cut back on government spending, for he feared that a growing federal budget deficit. In other words, once again, where the government's spending more money than they're taking in. As unemployment rose during 1937 and 1938, the government spent large sums of money to help the unemployed. Now, looking at economic theory, it was also kind of during this time that we began to see the emergence of the British economist John Maynard Keynes. And Keynes argued that deficit spending could provide jobs and stimulate the economy. And that becomes known as Keynesian economics. And so, he really felt that the government should do even more than they were doing. Even if it means deficit spending, keep spending to stimulate the economy. The economy did begin to rebound in the summer of 1938.